series on the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And over the last several weeks, we did right view, right intention. One of our guest speakers, Devin Berry, did the overall of the ethics component of right speech, right action, and right livelihood. And then we've been breaking that down. Trina gave a talk last week on right speech. And so I think before I begin, I want to offer this brief orientation for anybody who might be coming into this series for the first time, that it's the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path is not a ladder that we climb rung by rung, and it's not a checklist of spiritual accomplishments. It's a living, integrated path, 8 interdependent aspects of practice that develop together over time. And there are 3 parts of the Eightfold Path that are divided into wisdom, ethics, and meditation. Wisdom, which forms ethics, it informs ethics, and ethics stabilizes the mind, and meditation deepens wisdom. And so when we explore one factor of the path, we're not isolating it from the others. We're simply shining a light on one facet of a single jewel, trusting that the whole jewel is present. So even if you haven't been here for the previous talks, you're not behind. There's nothing to catch up on. But today we arrive at right action, known in Pali as samma kammanta. And this is where the Dharma becomes unmistakably visible. Not as an idea and not as an inner state, but as something that is present in the world through our bodies and through our choices and our relationships. And you're invited to bring your own life exactly as it is into this exploration. The Buddha offered the Noble Eightfold Path as a practical response to dukkha, the stress, dissatisfaction, and vulnerability woven into life. Rather than a belief system, the path is a training, a way of cultivating and understanding ethical responsiveness and mental freedom. And so traditionally, the path is grouped into those 3 interrelated areas. And so the first is wisdom, which I mentioned, that includes right view and right intention, the first 2 steps of the path. And right view is the understanding of the Four Noble Truths, that suffering exists, that it has causes, that it can end, and that there's a path leading to its end. Right intention flows from this understanding and orients the heart toward renunciation and non-ill will and non-harming. The second grouping is ethical conduct, sila, and that includes right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Devin Berry, who was our guest teacher last week, gave us an overview of this grouping. And these factors guide how we live in relationship with ourselves, with others, and with the larger system that we interact with. Ethics in Buddhism are not commandments imposed from the outside. They're protections. They protect the heart from regret, from agitation and fragmentation. The third grouping is mental discipline, samadhi, which includes right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And these factors cultivate steadiness, clarity, and collectedness of mind. Meditation doesn't float above our lives, it rests upon them. And when our actions are misaligned, the mind has trouble settling. And when our actions are congruent, the mind naturally steadies. Right action sits at the center of the path. It's where intention becomes behavior and where insight becomes embodied. Right action asks a deceptively simple question. How does awakening express itself through this body? We can understand impermanence intellectually and still act harshly, and we can value compassion and still cause harm. Right action brings the practice out of abstraction and into lived reality. The simplicity of this definition is intentional. Rather than creating an exhaustive moral code, the Buddha points to three domains where harm most often occurs. They're part of the five precepts. The simplicity of this definition is intentional, and so they aren't rules to be handed down from above, but training principles that are undertaken freely as experiments in reducing suffering. As Joseph Goldstein expresses in his epic book on mindfulness, some of you might be familiar with it, it's impossible to separate meditative wisdom from the moral understanding that makes it possible. The Buddha expresses this integrated path of practice in one famous verse of the Dhammapada. Avoid what is unskillful, do what is good, purify the mind. Especially in times of great cultural changes when there's often a useful questioning of old norms and values, it's helpful to re-articulate the importance of personal integrity and responsibility so that we don't simply get lost in the confusion of our desires and impulses. It's said that what moved the Buddha after his enlightenment was seeing people seeking happiness, yet doing the very things that brought about suffering. As Shantideva said, we are like senseless children who shrink from suffering but love its causes. That's a great sentence. We are like senseless children who shrink from suffering but love its causes. In right action, although all of these steps of right speech, right action, and right livelihood revolve around abstinence from unskillful acts, avoiding what is unskillful, each one also contains a positive expression, doing what is good. Right action is cultivating the clarity and strength of mind from those actions of the body, causing harm to oneself or others. In one of the suttas, the Buddha defines right action very succinctly. He asks, and what bhikkhus are the monastics that are following him, and what bhikkhus is right action? Refraining from taking life, refraining from taking what is not given, refraining from misconduct in sensual pleasures. This is called right action. So much of what the Buddha taught seems so obvious. Don't kill, don't steal, don't harm. Still, as we try to apply and practice this in our lives, we can meet the forward edge of our understanding and commitment. And this edge can be challenging, can be a challenging place to be. One teacher commented that if practicing the precepts doesn't make us uncomfortable, it's probably a sign that we should investigate them more deeply. I appreciate this comment because it points to these steps on the path as actual practices, things to understand and investigate in our lives rather than taking it for granted that we're basically good people and then looking no further. Bhikkhu Analio, a well-known and respected current-day German monk, emphasizes that the precepts are best understood as intentional commitments, not moral judgments. They function as mirrors. When we act in alignment with them, the mind feels lighter. When we violate them, contraction and agitation arise. Not because we're bad, but because suffering is being generated. The Buddha's teaching on karma becomes especially important here. He says in one of the suttas, AN 6.63, and I have a sheet of paper I'm going to hand out later that has some of the references to the suttas if you're interested in looking them up. He says, it is intention bhikkhus that I call kamma. That's the Pali word for karma, which is Sanskrit. Having intended, one acts by body, by speech, or mind. When that intention is abandoned, the action is abandoned. This teaching is sometimes misunderstood as minimizing impact, but the Buddha is doing something more subtle. He's pointing us to the place of training. Intention is where freedom is cultivated. Kamma is not fate. It is not a cosmic system of reward and punishment. It is the way of our actions. It's the way our actions shape the heart and the condition of the mind. Action educates us. We act from greed, hatred, or delusion, the mind contracts. There is agitation, defensiveness, and often regret. When we act from generosity, kindness, and clarity, the mind opens, and there's a sense of coherence and ease. Joseph Goldstein also reminds us that intention does not erase consequences, but it shapes how consequences are received and learned from. When we act carelessly, we feel contraction. When we act with care, even amid uncertainty, the heart stays more open. Right action in modern life often involves acting without certainty. We make the best choice we can with the information that we have, remaining open to feedback and staying willing to adjust. This willingness itself is a form of ethical maturity. The first expression of right action is refraining from taking life. The Buddha describes one who has given up killing as living, quote, without the rod and the sword, conscientious, compassionate, dwelling in kindness and sympathy for all living beings, end quote. This teaching extends far beyond literal killing. It includes how we relate to anger, to aggression, and to reactivity in ourselves. Many of us would never intentionally harm another being. And yet, if we look honestly, we may notice how quickly hostility arises in traffic, online, in political conversations, even toward ourselves. I often become acutely aware, which I've mentioned in some of my talks before, while driving. No outward harm occurs sometimes, but inside there's tightness and judgment and rehearsed arguments, and the body is being trained in aggression. Right action invites a pause, not to suppress the anger, but to refrain from acting it out internally. That too is non-harming. One of my first meditation teachers, Venerable Ayakema, taught that the true measure of practice is how we respond when things do not go our way. Non-harming begins when things do not go our way. We notice the impulse to strike, physically, verbally, or mentally, and choose not to follow it. One of the most honest questions that practitioners ask today is, how do we practice right action in a world that feels structurally unethical? We live inside economic, political, and technological systems that reward speed and extraction and disconnection. Even when our personal intentions are kind, we may find ourselves participating in harm simply by getting through the day. The Buddha, of course, didn't teach in a vacuum. He taught householders, merchants, rulers, parents, and people living in complex social worlds. Right action wasn't ever meant to be a retreat from life, but a way of meeting life with increasing clarity and responsibility. Bhikkhu Analayo also points out that the precepts function less as rules and more as ongoing contemplations. Ongoing contemplations. They're lessons that we look through again and again. The question is not, am I pure, but am I awake right now to the consequences of this action? In modern life, harm is often indirect. We don't see the hands that sewed our clothes, harvested our food, or assembled our devices. Right action begins by reconnecting cause and effect, not to induce guilt, but to invite care. Awareness itself is already an ethical act. This is where right action becomes deeply humbling. We start to see that goodness is not about achieving moral perfection, but about staying willing to be taught by our lives. Right action today includes how we consume, how we work, how we respond to injustice, how we care for the earth. The practice is not to be perfect, but to remain awake and responsive. Non-harming is not only moral, it's physiological. When we act aggressively, even subtly, the nervous system enters a state of contraction. And when we refrain from harm, something settles. This is why ethical conduct supports meditation so directly. Let's recognize how often our bodies tighten during online interactions, reading comments, reacting to headlines, composing responses that were never sent. No one else is affected, but internally the body is being trained toward vigilance and hostility. Right action invites a pause. Is this necessary? Is this helpful? Is this kind? Not unlike the steps of right speech that Trina was talking about last week. Kamma also taught that renunciation is not about giving things up, but about letting go of what disturbs the heart. Sometimes right action looks like not responding. Sometimes it looks like stepping back. Sometimes it looks like choosing rest over righteousness. So I'm going to pause here and allow the teachings to move from concept into experience. And I'd like to lead just a short guided meditation. So let's take a moment to settle into the position that feels good for us. And just feel the contact of the body with the chair or the cushion. Let the shoulders soften. Allow the hands to rest easily. And gently bring awareness to the hands. These hands touch the world. These hands can cause harm. And these hands can offer care. Simply feel the hands from the inside. Bring awareness to the feet or the legs. These are the parts of the body that carry us into action. Notice the sensations here. Now silently reflect on one recent action that arose from care or integrity. It doesn't need to be dramatic. Let yourself feel how that action registers in the body. Next, recall an action that brought regret or discomfort. Without judgment or self-blame, simply notice how the body responds. See if you can hold this experience with kindness. And rest with this intention. May my actions arise from clarity and care. When I forget, may I remember again. And let that settle in your heart. And if you want to, you can gently open your eyes again. Or not, stay as you are, but I'm going to continue by mentioning the second aspect of right action, which is refraining from taking that which is not given. This includes material possessions, but also time, attention, emotional labor, and credit. The Buddha encourages ethical reflection grounded in empathy, knowing that others cherish their lives and belongings as we cherish our own. In one sutta, the Buddha encourages ethical behavior through reflecting on shared humanity. Just as we cherish our own lives, safety, and possessions, so do others. Rather than appealing to fear or authority, the teaching invites us to have empathy as the basis for moral restraint. It supports an understanding of right action as relational and grounded in mutual respect. Gil Fronsdale of Insight Meditation Center in Redwood City, California, teaches that integrity brings relief. When we stop taking what is not given, the mind rests more easily. There is less subtle guilt and less need to defend ourselves. This precept is important in society and in our interpersonal relationships because it creates real refuges of safety. One of the most striking experiences at meditation retreats or other situations where groups of people are committed to following the precepts is that even if large amounts of money or valuables are left unlocked, they're safe. Joseph Goldstein refers to the beginning when they first opened Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts. People would sometimes ask for keys to their rooms, and they didn't even have any. And it was an education in right action that they weren't needed. we can see the tremendous impact and power of this step on the path when we look at the economic and social harm caused by the actions of people who are not committed to it. Although we may not be grand thieves, it would still be instructive to look at our lives and see if these are times when in some way we're taking things not freely offered. Just as the positive side of non-killing is cultivating loving care for all beings, the positive expression of non-stealing is contentment, which the Buddha called our greatest wealth. One of the statements that I always keep in mind is happy comfort of body and mind. How often do we actually notice ourselves in contentment as our greatest wealth? And in this time of overconsumption of resources, this expression of non-stealing might mean not taking or using more than we need. Of course, what we need is always a subjective evaluation, but we can at least begin to examine ourselves from this reference point. Do I really need this? In contemporary life, I think one of the most common forms of taking what is not given is attention. We interrupt, we multitask, we scroll while listening, to name just a few. The Buddhist teachings on non-stealing extend naturally into this domain. To refrain from taking what is not given means to respect boundaries, visible and invisible. Bill Fronsdale notes that integrity is felt immediately. When we pause before taking, when we ask rather than assume, the body relaxes. Trust grows not because we are perfect, but because we are careful. This is always a tough one when you're in relationship or someone was living in your household. I can say certainly for myself that I tend to interrupt, and he tends to scroll while listening. And we just keep trying to be kinder and non-harming and clear some of that up. But some of these habits are really, really strong. Gil Fronsdale notes that integrity is felt immediately. When we pause before taking, when we ask rather than assuming, the body relaxes. Trust grows, not because we're perfect, but because we are careful. So next, the third area of right action concerns sexuality. The Buddha emphasizes not repression, but non-harming. This can mean different things depending on the context of our lives. For monks and nuns or meditators on retreat, it means refraining from any sexual activity. But what does this step on the path mean for lay people living in the world? Thich Nhat Hanh describes it well in his discussion of the third precept, when he says, aware of the suffering caused by sexual misconduct, I vow to cultivate responsibility and learn ways to protect the safety and integrity of individuals, couples, families, and society. To preserve the happiness of myself and others, I am determined to respect my commitments and the commitments of others. I will do everything in my power to protect children from sexual abuse and to prevent couples and families from being broken by sexual misconduct. It's important to become conscious and mindful in this area because, as we all know, sexual energy is a tremendous, powerful force. In the Buddhist teachings, this one's DN 31, He talks about sexual misconduct described as behavior that undermines trust and safety and relational stability. The core question is not desire, but impact. The Buddha's guidance on sexual conduct is often misunderstood as moral conservatism. In reality, it's deeply relational. This sutta is often called the householder's code of discipline. It offers practical guidance for ethical living within relationships, families, and society. Sexual misconduct is framed not as moral failing, but as behavior that undermines trust and safety and social harmony. The teaching emphasizes responsibility, care, and the long-term consequences of actions on oneself and others. Aya Santusika, one of my favorite nuns who teaches on Saturdays online, she says sexuality is one of the most powerful places to practice mindfulness because it so easily overrides wisdom. Sexuality is one of the most powerful places to practice mindfulness because it so easily overrides wisdom. Right action asks us to include future consequences in present moments of awareness. Wise sexual conduct is not about suppressing desire. It's about holding desire inside a wider field of care. And this is an area where honesty with ourselves and others is essential. The Buddha did not expect practitioners to be flawless. In the Angulimala Sutta, MN 86, even if one who committed grave harm is not excluded from awakening. This powerful narrative tells a story of Angulimala. He was a former murderer who becomes a monk and ultimately awakens. I won't go into the whole story, but he wore a mala of fingers. Every person that he killed, he had their fingers on his mala. And his 100th person was going to be the Buddha. And if you ever read any sutta, this one is a really great one to read, because the way that the Buddha stops Angulimala is through his presence. And no matter how fast Angulimala runs toward him, he can never catch the Buddha. And so, and he says in the sutta how he can stop raging horses and oxen that pull carts, but he can never catch up to the Buddha. And the Buddha has an amazing response with him. And at that point, Angulimala goes to the ground and says, "I am your student. Please take me in." And needless to say, there was a lot of upset within the monastic community of having a person who had committed so many murders. There's a lot to that sutta. So anyway, it relates that right action includes remorse and restraint and transformation, and that liberation remains possible even after grave wrongdoing. Ethical action isn't about being right, it's about being aligned. Transformation is possible because responsibility is taken. One of the most important teachings for modern practitioners is this: repair is part of the path. Repair is part of the path. Right action includes apology, restitution, and changed behavior. It also includes learning how to stay present with the discomfort of having caused harm. Sharon Salzberg reminds us that self-hatred does not prevent future harm. Awareness and kindness do. She also reminds us that loving kindness includes ourselves, not to excuse harm, but to support the courage required to begin again. We must hold ourselves in loving kindness and not exclude ourselves. So I think I'll wrap this up by a few more paragraphs here on right action, including acknowledging harm, making amends when possible, and learning rather than hardening. Remorse in Buddhism is not self-hatred, it's the capacity to feel the weight of our actions without collapsing. Ethical conduct stabilizes the mind. When our actions align with our values, meditation deepens naturally. Bhikkhu Analayo emphasizes that sila, or harmonious living, is not something we complete. It's something that we practice moment by moment. Each act of restraint supports mindfulness. Each act of care supports insight. Right action is not separate from awakening. It is awakening expressing itself in the world. Right action is a direction, not a destination. Each day offers new opportunities to notice intention, to pause before acting, to repair when we miss the mark. Ethical life is not rigid, it's responsive. It is taught that sila matures alongside of insight. As we see more clearly, harmful actions lose their appeal. Kindness becomes less effortful. At this point, we can sense how deeply right action supports every other aspect of the path. Living ethically and purely is both the ground of the Buddhist path and its result. When our actions are aligned, the mind settles more easily. When the mind is settled, wisdom deepens. And when wisdom deepens, compassionate action follows naturally. I think I'll stop here and let the words settle down. And if anything I said seems complicated or didn't make sense, just let it flow off of you. And if you found that some of what I said made sense and could be useful, then let those words sink in and be reflected. So let's just have a brief closing meditation. Allowing the body to settle once more. Feel the breath moving naturally. Gently reflect, my actions matter. As best I can, may my actions arise from care. When I forget, may I remember again. May you learn from your actions without harshness. May your body become a place of kindness. May your choices contribute to less suffering in the world. May ethical living feel like relief rather than burden. And once again, let's take some time to envision someone in our life to dedicate the merit of our practice to today. May the merit of our practice benefit all sentient beings. Let's take some time to gently open our eyes and notice more sensations coming to the eyes and other senses. And I have a paper to pass out with some questions on it so that we can have a little discussion. I don't know how many are here. Bill, would you mind passing these? There might not be enough for everybody. So if two people together have some people share. I think I only printed 8. I don't know. And I'll mention the questions and then I'm going to stop the recording of the meeting. And I'll put them in the chat for people online in just a second. Where in my daily life do I notice the clearest connection between intention and consequences? What forms of harm feel most subtle or habitual for me right now? How does my body respond when I act with integrity? How does it respond when I don't? In what ways do modern systems make ethical clarity difficult? And where do I still have choice? What does repair look like in my life when I act unskillfully? How might ethical living support rather than limit my meditation practice? So I'm sorry I came up with so many questions. I try usually to just limit it to 3. And I'm going to stop the recording right now.